Segregation is a major problem here in the United States, and many have come to the misguided assumption that it is largely coincidental, that these racial groups have organized themselves into these neighborhoods on purpose, when in actuality it is the result of many segregational policies, one of which is redlining. Where does it all begin? Let's start with the Great Depression. The Great Depression allowed for enormous government expansion through the New Deal. With this, the government created numerous organizations and acts to combat a major housing crisis of the time. Peyton is going to go into a little bit more detail into a few of these acts and organizations.
Because so many Americans struggle with housing, the National Housing Act of 1934 looked to make housing and home ownership more available and also put an end to a massive wave of bank foreclosures. In 1935, the Federal Home Loan Bank Board asked the Homeowners Loan Corporation to look at several cities and create a sort of residential safety map to rank the level of security for real estate investments in different parts of each of these cities. Now, this may seem like a rather good idea, yet these laws suffer from immense racial bias, allowing for creators to effectively segregate cities to their liking. Now, Sharif is going to show you how this may have looked.
Let's say we have some fictional city, and let's call it Gloucestertown. Let's say many of the older buildings in the city and a large percentage of the city's poor African American population lives here. And then maybe a wider, more affluent citizenry inhabits this area. Meanwhile, in southeastern Gloucestertown, one could find a more impoverished white demographic, whereas in southwestern Gloucestertown, a predominantly African American neighborhood is quickly developing. Now Peyton is going to walk you through the rest.
In the process of making these redline maps, the HOLC would place these separate areas into a ranking system for future real estate investments. Type A would be a desirable area. Type B would be still desirable, but not quite as desirable as Type A. Type C would be considered declining, and Type D would be the most risky investment to make. As for Gloucestertown, Type A would be considered the white affluent neighborhood. The old poor African American neighborhood would be considered to be Type D. The rather poor white neighborhood would be considered Type B. And the developing African American neighborhood would be considered Type C. Now logically you would think that Area B and Area C would be flipped, which shows an obvious racial undertones were a major factor in the making of these maps, and as you can assume, this would lead to major difficulties in the development for areas C and areas D. Now what are the implications of this? Sharif will go into detail.
Now, recent research indicates that the HLC was indeed corrupt in drafting these maps, yet urban planning historians theorize that they were still used by private and public entities for decades as a tool to deny loans and insurance to Black communities, halting development and prompting decay and segregation. Now, Peyton will go into a few more of the immediate effects of this policy before I tap into some of the long-term effects.
These immediate effects included the paralysis of the housing market, lowered property values, and short after, abandonment by landlords. Some of these redline properties would go on to become centers for illegal activity, which of course would only worsen the property value even further than it already was.
To illustrate these long-term consequences, I will now walk you through a series of maps and graphs. So if we take a look at Chicago and Chicago's redlining map that the HOLC made in the 1930s, we can see the Black Belt here with a high concentration of African Americans in the city. Now, if we look at a map of Chicago today, we can see that this segregation persists as the Black parts of the city are still highly separated from the other ethnic parts of the city, mostly the white parts of the city. And as you can expect, this segregation has enormous consequences. If you look at the income growth for whites and Blacks in Chicago, you can see immense disparities. Further, if you look at poverty rates, Blacks exceed that of whites by a tremendous amount, over double. And even further, we can look at the unemployment rate, and again, that of Blacks is almost 3 times that of whites.
As we've discussed, segregation has been a major problem in the United States, and much of this segregation can be attributed to policies as cruel and as blunt as redlining. We hope to have opened your mind in this video, and if you have any questions, please place them in the comment section below. Thank you.
Fight!